This lecture covers environmental health policy and law. The learning objectives for this lecture are to understand the legal and policy framework for environmental health and to understand the changing roles of federal, state, and local agencies in advancing environmental policies and influencing environmental decision-making. Here's an outline of what we'll go over in this lecture. So we'll start with a little history of environmental health policy in the U.S. Then we'll give a little bit of a rationale for policy, taking an economic perspective to talk about why the government has gotten involved and what a rationale for that involvement is, and some of the approaches that have been taken to environmental policy. Then we'll go over two of the key laws in the United States, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. We'll talk about some of the key elements of these laws and how those have evolved over time. And finally, we'll use a couple of case studies to look at U.S. environmental policy in action, some of the strengths and weaknesses of these policies through the Flint, Michigan drinking water crisis and U.S. involvement in climate change policy. So the first part of this lecture will talk about the background and history of U.S. environmental health policy. This is a snapshot of what the United States looked like in the early 20th century and where some of the impetus for the early environmental health movement came from. So the effects of the Industrial Revolution included crowded cities with polluted air and water, and infectious disease outbreaks, so unsafe drinking water, unsanitary conditions leading to outbreaks of things like typhoid and cholera. In the United States, as well as in Europe, organized public health efforts can be traced back to the sanitary movement going back to the 19th century. All the way back in 1799, the city of Boston established its first board of health, the first board of health in the country actually, in response to cholera outbreaks. Cholera is transmitted by unsafe drinking water. And the commissioner, very first commissioner of the country's first board of health was Paul Revere. In 1805, New York City established its own board of health in response to yellow fever epidemics, which were killing thousands of people in that city. Yellow fever is transmitted by mosquitoes, which breed in standing water. So in 1844, John Hoskins Griscom delivered a lecture on the sanitary condition of the laboring population of New York with suggestions for its improvement. And this lecture put forward a sort of novel thesis, which was that the unsafe living conditions of populations, crowding, unsafe water, were leading to illness and sort of a breakdown of the moral fabric of society. The prevailing wisdom was actually the opposite, that people were sick because they lacked moral fiber, because, and this was sort of leading to these slums. And so this growing recognition that the environment in which people were living was making them sick led to efforts like the Sanitary Survey of Massachusetts in 1850, which was really sort of the first organized effort to collect information about the prevalence of different illnesses and people's living conditions, and provided the impetus for early public health programs in that city. And also eventually led to the first state board of health in Massachusetts in 1869. These early public health efforts were very local, so boards of health would conduct door-to-door surveys assessing the sanitary conditions. There were efforts to build privies or latrines that people could use. And as you can see at the top, it says, of this little flyer, it says to be tacked inside of the privy and not torn down. So there's a focus on educating the public about how to safely dispose of human waste, how to protect water supplies, how to screen homes to prevent entrance of mosquitoes and flies, and some messages emphasized here. For health's sake, let's keep this privy clean. Bad privies are our greatest cause of disease. So emphasizing the links between environmental conditions and health, really at that very local level. So into the early 20th century, state and local public health departments were really where the action was in terms of addressing environmental health issues. And the issues they were focused on, again, were sanitation, drinking water protection, sewage treatment, control of some air pollution nuisances from factories and the like, and food safety. The federal government played a pretty limited role, and their focus was really on things like natural resource management, so managing public lands, mining, different, resource extraction. They also regulated interstate commerce, and invested in infrastructure. So think of the New Deal highway system and building large dams, things like that. The federal government's regulatory role was really limited to ingestible products, so food and drugs, cosmetics, overseen by the Food and Drug Administration. The Department of Agriculture focused on, obviously, agriculture, and so had some say over pesticide applications. The Public Health Service does date back to 1798 in the United States at the federal level, but its role really was limited to research and technical assistance for various issues, and it left most of the regulation and enforcement to the states. The shift to the modern era of environmental health policy can be captured in this quote. "The great question of this decade is, shall we surrender to our surroundings, or shall we make peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, our land, and our water? Restoring nature to its natural state is a cause beyond party and beyond factions. It has become a common cause of all the people of America." So clearly this is capturing a need to address this at the federal level. And the question I have is, who said this and when? So was this Harry Truman in 1950? Do you think this was John Kennedy in 1961? Was this Richard Nixon in 1970? Or Jimmy Carter in 1978? If you guessed Richard Nixon, you're correct. So this was from his State of the Union message in 1970. So was Nixon some tree-hugging liberal who just came up with these ideas on his own and thought, hey, woke up one day and said, we really need to do a better job of protecting the environment? Well, no, of course not. Nixon's action was in response to a growing environmental movement across the country, spurred in large part by the publishing of Silent Spring in 1962. The Cuyahoga River Fire was another galvanizing event in the environmental movement. So the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland was very polluted, covered in sort of the permanent layer of oil from industrial pollution. And it caught on fire actually repeatedly over and over again. So the fire shown in this image occurred in 1952, but it was published in 1969 in Time magazine, and this galvanized public support across the country for taking action to regulate environmental waste, industrial waste. And a major player in this movement was the mayor of Cleveland, Carl Stokes. So this environmental movement culminated in 1970 again, so the same year when Nixon was taking action was also the year that we had the first Earth Day. Earth Day was founded by the Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson, who was a Democrat, but it was co-chaired by Republican Congressman Pete McCloskey. And so this really underlines what we're going to see is that the origins of the environmental movement were very bipartisan. This was not a Democratic or Republican issue. There was sort of a national consensus around the need to address these environmental problems. So how did this new federal environmental policy take shape? Well, Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency through an executive order in 1970. This was actually not a new mandate or a new set of activities, but a reorganization that brought various programs that were dealing with the environment and environmental pollution into one agency. So for example, the Federal Water Quality Administration had been in the Interior Department, now came under the EPA. Pesticide Regulation Authority from the Department of Agriculture now became part of the EPA. Radiation regulation from the Atomic Energy Commission. So the EPA was sort of an amalgamation of these different environmental actions and authorities. William Ruckelshaus was the first administrator of the EPA. He had a background as a prosecutor and took an aggressive stance towards going after industrial polluters. In describing the mission of this new entity, the EPA, he emphasizes an integrated approach. So he says there's little sense in removing impurities for the air only to pour them back into the rivers and streams. We need to keep in mind the whole problem as we deal with each of its parts. He emphasizes the responsibility for research, standard setting, monitoring, and enforcement with regard to a number of different threats. And he acknowledges this awesome obligation to protect and improve the environment. He says, our country is awakened. We must channel this newfound awareness into constructive action for a better and cleaner America. So again, the EPA was established through an executive action, so through the executive branch of government. And here we have a timeline of the environmental laws and policies passed by Congress, by the legislative branch. What's striking here is how many of these were passed in the 1970s. So we call this the environmental decade. Uh, Many of the greatest hits, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, all of these occurred in the 1970s. Here's another way of looking at that timeline. So what we're showing here at the bottom are those different acts. The acronyms refer to different policies that were listed in the previous slide. The color coding is showing the party affiliation of the Congress and the president. And what we see here, again, emphasizing that environmentalism for a long time really was a bipartisan issue. So we have, Republican presidents like Nixon working with Democratic Congress to pass the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. Reagan working with a mixed Congress to pass the Safe Drinking Water Act, for example. So more recently, we think of environmentalism as being sort of more affiliated with the left, but this was not the case at the beginning.
Of course, what we have seen in recent times is that environmental action has followed kind of the whims of the presidency, with major action in one direction happening under Democrats and action in the other direction under Republicans. The Trump administration, the major focus was on rolling back environmental health regulations. In fact, some accounts say that Trump rolled back more than 125 environmental safeguards, and that was clearly the main intention of his environmental policy. Well, under the Obama presidency, we've seen another shift in environmental policy making. Following decades of activism by environmental justice advocates, we are finally seeing this really at the forefront. It's worth noting that the first environmental justice executive order actually occurred decades ago during the Clinton presidency. But in terms of seeing this as a focus of environmental policy throughout all of government, that has been this major shift. And as we'll talk about later when we talk about climate change, we've also seen some major action during the Obama presidency in that direction. So a swing, again, the pendulum swinging more in the direction of environmental action across different sectors. Another feature of environmental policy at the federal level during the current era is that with this politicization and the reality that major environmental legislation, right, laws and action through Congress really only happens when the Democrats are in control. And so what the presidency has, since we've had sort of this split control of the Congress, both during the Trump era, Obama era, Trump era, and Biden era, the president has not been able to pass major legislation in a lot of different areas, including environmental policy. And so a lot of what they've done is to make policy through executive action. So for example, this is an environmental policy that an executive order on climate change under the Obama presidency. This is an executive order during the Trump presidency, kind of rolling back which waters of the United States were subject to the Clean Water Act. And finally, under the Obama presidency, as just mentioned, this sort of executive order codifying this commitment to environmental justice.
So as a result of all of this policymaking, we now have a system of environmental policy across the country that can be somewhat confusing in terms of determining who's in charge. So we have over a dozen major agencies at the federal level that have numerous programs that have jurisdiction over different environmental health issues. And really the federal government's role is to set minimum standards for environmental quality. At the state level, there's a similar complexity in organizational structure, hundreds of different agencies and organizations, and state agencies are mandated to comply with and enforce these federal minimum standards. They may set more stringent standards of their own, so if they want to go beyond what the federal government has mandated, that is allowed, but they have to at least meet those minimums. And over time, particularly as we'll talk about with a shift from more command and control approaches to market-based solutions, there's some leeway that the states have in experimenting and innovating in their approaches to meeting these standards. Here's a snapshot of what that complex web looks like, some of the different players that we're talking about. So within the legislative branch, all of those different acts that we discussed. The executive branch, we have the Office of Management and Budget, the Congressional Budget Office, the judicial branch, the courts, numerous different federal agencies from the Department of Transportation to Health and Human Services, Department of Defense, Department of the Interior. And then similarly at the state level, so there's the legislature, the governor's office, the judicial branch, and then various different agencies. And so as we'll see when we get into the next parts of this lecture, depending on the issue at hand, various different players are going to play a role in regulating and improving environmental quality.
To wrap up this portion of the lecture by just highlighting that, as mentioned, with the difficulties in passing major legislation at the federal level, given the sort of gridlock and mix of control between Democrats and Republicans, it's really been up to states to take the lead, and in a lot of respects, Colorado is doing a lot of this. So these are just a couple of examples. Colorado has recently passed some major legislation around reducing greenhouse gas reduction or reducing greenhouse gases, and also around promoting environmental justice. And so I think, again, we are seeing a lot of action at the states, and that can also create some inequities, right? Because some states are taking more action than others. And so that wraps up part one of this lecture.